I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are sitting in your favorite coffee shop.
Oh, yeah, we all have that one spot, right?
Exactly. You know the vibe. You've got your drink. You're sitting right across from a good friend, and you're just settling in for, a really long conversation.
It's a nice setting. Comfortable.
Right. But it's comfortable because for a neurotypical brain, the background noise in that environment is subjected to this neurological process called sensory gating.
Right, the filtering system.
Yeah, exactly. Your brain automatically identifies like the whirring of the espresso machine or the clinking of ceramic mugs, the overlapping conversations of people 3 tables away.
And it just categorizes all of that as irrelevant data,
It totally tunes it out. It essentially turns down the volume on the whole room, right? Isolating just the frequency of your friend's voice so you can actually focus.
which takes zero conscious effort for most people.
None at all. Now, I want you to imagine that your sensory gating mechanism is just completely broken.
Oh, wow.
The volume knob on every single discrete sound in that room is cranked up to maximum, and it's permanently locked there.
So it's all coming in at once.
Exactly. The espresso machine is literally roaring. A dropped spoon sounds like a cymbal crash right next to your ear. You hear the argument of the couple across the room with the exact same linguistic clarity and volume as the friend sitting 2 feet in front of you.
That sounds exhausting.
Your neurological architecture refuses to filter anything out. It just all hits your auditory cortex with the exact same level of intensity entirely simultaneously.
Which means your cognitive bandwidth is just immediately exhausted by the physiological act of simply existing in that room.
Right. You're just sitting there.
Yeah, if your brain is actively processing every single ambient sound as like a high-priority threat or primary data stream, the prefrontal cortex, which is the area responsible for maintaining the thread of the conversation with your friend, is completely starved of resources.
It's got nothing left to give.
Exactly. You're basically experiencing a constant, low-grade neurological crisis that is just disguised as a casual coffee date.
And that overwhelming, unfiltered, high-definition reality is the baseline for the material we're diving into today.
It's intense.
It really is. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a deeply personal first-hand account recorded in May of 2026. So very recent.
Super recent, yeah.
The source is a comprehensive diary entry written by an individual who is diagnosed with both autism spectrum disorder and ADHD.
A dual diagnosis, which comes with its own unique complexities.
Definitely. And over the course of 2 consecutive days, May 24th and 25th, this author attended a specialized online self-help group via Zoom.
Right. Specifically structured for people navigating developmental disorders and what they refer to as gray zone traits.
Yeah, those gray zone traits are fascinating. But the value of this specific document lies in its origin, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we aren't analyzing a clinical observation from, like, a psychiatrist who might be projecting their own neurotypical assumptions onto a patient.
Right, reading it from the outside.
Yeah. This is an inside-out mapping of the neurodivergent experience. The author is articulating the hidden internal landscape of their own cognition with just remarkable precision.
It's so rare to get this level of detail, and the roadmap for our discussion today is essentially a journey through that exact hidden landscape.
We've got a lot of ground to cover.
We do. We are going to look at the severe physiological cost of masking, the intense sociolinguistic calculations required to, translate neurodivergent realities for neurotypical people.
Which is a huge burden on its own.
Massive. And we'll also look at the systemic family dynamics that ultimately triggered the author's pursuit of independence.
But to frame this correctly, we really have to look past the clinical diagnoses here.
Yeah, totally.
This is fundamentally a human narrative. It's about the friction between a highly specialized brain and a society that's engineered for generalists.
I love that phrasing. Engineered for generalists.
Right. And the author joined this self-help group because they were trying to find part-time employment suited to their condition. But they admitted they lacked the psychological momentum to actually pursue it.
They were paralyzed by the idea of it.
Exactly. They needed to hear the practical failures, the structural hurdles, and most importantly, the survival strategies of other neurodivergent individuals who were actively maintaining employment.
Which makes sense. But the barrier to entry for simply joining that kind of group in the first place is massive.
Oh, it's huge. Think about the executive dysfunction associated with ADHD, compounded by the social anxiety that frequently co-occurs with ASD.
Right. Just getting out the door is hard.
Exactly. The simple act of like walking into a physical community center, sitting in a circle of folding chairs, and managing the sensory input of a dozen strangers in some fluorescent-lit room.
Ugh, the fluorescent lights alone.
Right. For a lot of people, that is an insurmountable wall.
Which brings us to the technological infrastructure, because this is where things get really interesting. The author specifically notes that compared to their attempts to join similar groups, say 3 to 5 years prior, the current iteration of the platform Zoom Workplace in this case was significantly more accommodating.
Yeah, the tech is caught up in a way that actually helps.
They highlight the immediate ability to blur their background and, even more importantly, the option to keep their camera completely off without having to navigate some labyrinth of settings.
And that ability to control the visual environment is not just a convenience. It fundamentally alters the sympathetic nervous system's response to social engagement.
How so? Like physically?
Yeah, physically. In a traditional face-to-face interaction, the cognitive load is just immense. You are constantly monitoring your own posture, ensuring you're maintaining the culturally appropriate duration of eye contact.
Which feels super unnatural for a lot of people.
Exactly. And you're suppressing self-stimulatory behaviors, or stimming, and worrying about how your physical environment is being judged. By allowing the camera to remain off, the technology effectively eliminates the necessity for all that physical performance.
Okay, but I'm going to push back on the prevailing corporate philosophy here for a second.
Sir, go for it.
Because over the last few years, we've seen this massive push in the corporate world insisting that cameras must be on for quote-unquote genuine connection.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right. Operating under this assumption that hiding your face degrades the quality of the interaction.
Yeah.
Does this source suggest that the cameras on mandate is just a neurotypical bias that actually prevents connection for a significant portion of the population?
Honestly, yes. It is entirely a neurotypical bias.
Wow.
So
Okay.
the assumption that eye contact and facial visibility are prerequisites for connection relies on a brain architecture that processes visual social cues effortlessly.
Which isn't the case for everyone.
Right. For someone who experiences facial processing as a high-effort, conscious calculation, forcing them to turn the camera on diverts their cognitive resources entirely away from the actual exchange of ideas.
So the visual demands are literally a barrier to understanding.
Exactly. For this author, the anonymity of the blank screen is the precise mechanism that creates psychological safety. It isolates the interaction to just auditory data, which they can process much more effectively when they aren't simultaneously running a physical simulation of normalcy.
So the blank screen isn't isolation at all, it's optimization.
That's a great way to put it. It optimizes their processing power.
It strips out the visual noise so the cognitive processor can actually handle the conversation. But even with that perfectly optimized, safe virtual environment, the author's very first active participation in the group on day one, it immediately spiraled into a neurological misfire.
Yeah, that part of the diary was tough to read. They entered day one intending only to observe and listen.
Just a fly on the wall.
Right. However, during the introduction phase, they experienced what they describe as machine gun talk.
Machine gun talk. That's such a vivid phrase.
It really is. The verbal impulsivity just took over. They began speaking at this rapid-fire pace, unable to regulate the flow of information, and ultimately, they just completely lost the thread of their own initial point.
Which they explicitly identify as a classic manifestation of their ADHD.
Yeah, that lack of verbal inhibition.
But I want to look at the physiological fallout of that moment, because they didn't just feel a little embarrassed. The author describes breaking out in cold sweats, and their hands were physically shaking. The internal perception was one of just catastrophic failure.
And that physical response is the sympathetic nervous system literally flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline.
So a full-on fight-or-flight response.
Exactly. The brain perceives the loss of conversational control as a profound social threat. The ADHD brain often struggles with verbal inhibition because the dopamine pathways in the prefrontal cortex, basically the braking system of the brain, they're under-resourced.
So the brakes are out.
Right. The thought generation outpaces the verbal execution, resulting in that machine gun delivery.
And they know it's happening while it's happening, right?
That's the worst part. The conscious mind watches it happen, recognizes that it violates neurotypical conversational norms, and triggers a severe stress response.
But the paradox here, and honestly the most painful aspect of this entire diary entry, is how the rest of the group reacted to this perceived catastrophic failure.
Yeah, this was wild.
The author is sitting there, physically vibrating with adrenaline, sweating, absolutely convinced they have ruined their introduction. And the other members of the group, these veterans of the community, respond with praise.
They loved it.
Yeah. They commend the author for being incredibly logical and state that their narrative was exceptionally easy to follow.
And that praise, surprisingly, is devastating to the author.
Why, though? I mean, if you think you failed and a room full of your peers tells you that you actually succeeded, shouldn't that alleviate the cortisol spike?
You'd think so, but not when the success is actually a symptom of a trauma response.
Ah.
The author explains to the group that this perceived eloquence is the result of over-adaptation, commonly referred to as masking.
Masking. We hear that term a lot, but what does it really mean here?
Masking is not merely putting on a professional persona. It is a systemic, high-cost survival mechanism that is usually developed from early childhood.
Because they learn early on that their natural way of being isn't accepted?
Exactly. The neurodivergent brain learns that its natural state is unacceptable to the world around it, so it builds an elaborate, highly calculated simulation of neurotypical behavior.
Okay, I see.
The tragedy of this moment is the double bind. The author has built a simulation so effective, so perfectly logical, that it completely obscures their actual internal suffering.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Right. When they attempt to disclose their distress, the performance of competence is so convincing that their distress is just invalidated by everyone else.
I want to construct an analogy here to make the mechanics of this clear. We often hear the swan on the water metaphor.
Right, gliding calmly above, paddling furiously underneath.
Exactly. But based on the neurology you just described, that feels way too passive.
It's much more intense than that.
Right. It's more like running a high-end video game on a laptop with a failing cooling fan.
Ooh, I like this.
The graphics on the screen look flawless to the observer. The dialogue is rendering perfectly, the logic is sound, but inside the machine, the processor is maxed out at 100%, the battery is draining in minutes, and the motherboard is physically overheating to the point of permanent hardware damage.
That is spot on.
The group only sees the flawless graphics on the screen. They have absolutely no idea the internal hardware is melting down to produce it.
That is a much more accurate representation of the physiological cost. Running that neurotypical simulation requires the continuous conscious engagement of the prefrontal cortex to monitor tone, suppress tangential thoughts, and modulate delivery.
It sounds exhausting.
It is an unsustainable allocation of energy. The exhaustion the author feels isn't just emotional. It is a literal depletion of metabolic resources in the brain.
If you are listening to this right now, and you have ever been in a high-stakes professional scenario where you were entirely out of your depth, maybe defending a project you knew was flawed, or navigating a really hostile performance review, think about the deep physical fatigue you felt the moment that one-hour meeting ended.
You just want to collapse.
Exactly. That exhaustion is what happens when you have to consciously manufacture a persona under threat. Now imagine that the threat doesn't end when the meeting is over. Imagine that manufacturing that persona is the prerequisite for stepping out of your front door every single day of your life.
Just existing requires that level of performance. And when the author articulated this specific agony of over-adaptation to the group, the pain of being praised for the mask that is basically suffocating them, the response was profound.
The group got it.
They really did. The other members strongly resonated with the experience. That shared validation of the double-bind was a crucial moment of alignment for everyone.
It transitions the narrative from internal panic to external analysis. Once that baseline of shared reality was established on day one, the author was able to regulate their participation much better on day two.
They found their footing.
Yeah, they successfully inhibited their verbal impulsivity, held back, and engaged in the primary objective, listening to the concrete realities of the workplace.
And the discussion on that second day pivoted away from internal psychology to structural employment barriers.
Right, they got into the nitty-gritty of jobs.
The group began sharing specific, granular examples of workplace failure. And a pervasive shared obstacle across multiple narratives was the requirement for multitasking, specifically within administrative environments.
Let's look at the specific examples they cited, because they seem incredibly mundane on the surface. Like they talked about the inability to take a phone call while simultaneously navigating a switchboard to transfer another line.
Classic office task.
Right, or the failure to listen to verbal instructions while typing those instructions out on a keyboard. Why are these specific combinations, auditory processing mixed with fine motor execution, such a catastrophic bottleneck for this population?
Well, to understand the bottleneck, we have to look at the mechanics of working memory.
Okay, let's break that down.
Working memory isn't just a passive storage unit. It's a multi-component system. You have the phonological loop, which processes auditory and linguistic information.
So, hearing and understanding words.
Exactly. And then you have the visual-spatial sketchpad, which handles visual and motor spatial data.
Seeing things and moving your hands.
Right. And overseeing both of these is the central executive, which allocates attention between the two. In many ADHD and autistic profiles, the central executive struggles to rapidly switch resources back and forth.
Okay, so when an administrative protocol demands that an employee listen to a frustrated client on the phone,
The phonological loop is maxed out, just decoding the linguistic data and managing the emotional tone of the caller.
it's fully occupied.
Yes. If the system then demands that the employee simultaneously execute fine motor commands to type data or navigate a complex UI on a screen, the central executive cannot distribute the cognitive load.
It just crashes.
The competing data streams collide in the basal ganglia, and the processing system essentially freezes. It is not a lack of effort or a deficit in intelligence. It is a structural limitation in how the brain routes simultaneous cross-modal data.
The environment demands a parallel processor, but the employee is operating on an incredibly powerful sequential processor.
That's the perfect way to summarize it.
And the fallout from that mismatch isn't just a dropped call. The participants in the self-help group detail the severe emotional trauma inflicted by colleagues who interpreted these neurological bottlenecks as incompetence, or worse, laziness.
Which happens all the time.
Just thoughtless, punitive comments from neurotypical coworkers who completely lack a functional understanding of developmental disorders.
Which perfectly illustrates the social model of disability.
Can you explain that model real quick?
Sure. The cognitive trait itself, the sequential processing style, is not inherently disabling. What disables the individual is the insistence on placing them in an environment optimized exclusively for a neurotypical generalist brain architecture.
Ah, so it's the environment that's the problem.
Exactly. The modern office is historically derived from Frederick Taylor's scientific management theories from the early 20th century.
Oh, right, the
And-
assembly line mindset.
Yeah, which prioritized interchangeable workers capable of juggling multiple fragmented tasks. It is an environment fundamentally hostile to a brain that requires deep, singular focus.
I have to challenge the current corporate discourse on this, though, because every major company right now has some sort of neurodiversity inclusion initiative.
Oh, definitely. It's a huge buzzword.
Right. But if we analyze the actual mechanics of an administrative role, the job is the interruption. The core function of a receptionist or a lower-level admin is to be a human router for unpredictable, multimodal data streams.
That is literally the job description.
So how can a workplace reasonably accommodate a sequential processor in a role that fundamentally requires parallel processing? Or are we just pretending that handing out noise-canceling headphones solves a structural incompatibility?
You've hit the nail on the head. Noise-canceling headphones are a superficial patch on a systemic flaw.
They don't change the job itself.
No, they don't. True accommodation requires job carving or workflow redesign. It requires identifying the outcome the business actually needs, for example, accurate data entry and client communication, and dismantling the demand that one single person do both of those things simultaneously.
You separate the tasks.
You decouple the auditory intake from the visual motor output. The refusal to restructure the work and the insistence on trying to force a specialized neurodivergent brain to operate like a neurotypical generalist is exactly what generates the trauma the group is discussing.
It's like trying to force a sports car to go off-roading and then getting mad when it gets stuck.
Exactly. And as the author was listening to these detailed accounts of administrative failures and toxic colleagues, their own brain was processing the information in a way that completely dismantles one of the most pervasive medical stereotypes about autism.
This part blew my mind.
Is so important.
The author describes an intensely high baseline of empathy to the point where they classify it as a form of sensory hypersensitivity.
It's visceral for them.
When they listen to a narrative, even a tertiary narrative about a friend's former partner, the emotional resonance and the situational variables just bypass their cognitive filters entirely and flood directly into their consciousness.
During the Zoom session, simply hearing the other participants describe the stress of failing at the switchboard or enduring insults from coworkers caused the author's brain to auto-generate highly vivid, simulated sensory experiences.
Like they were living it.
Yeah. They felt as though they were physically occupying those administrative roles, enduring the ambient noise, and absorbing the specific, localized panic of the person telling the story.
This phenomenon strikes at the heart of a massive historical error in psychiatric diagnostic criteria, doesn't it?
Oh, a catastrophic error.
Because for decades, the clinical consensus was that autistic individuals possessed a deficit in empathy.
Right, that they just didn't care or couldn't feel what others were feeling.
But this arose because researchers observed a lack of neurotypical social signaling and just completely misinterpreted it as a lack of internal feeling. What this diary entry provides is incredible evidence for the intense world theory of autism.
Which argues the exact opposite, correct?
Right, that the autistic brain isn't detached at all. It is catastrophically overwhelmed by its environment.
Precisely. We have to separate cognitive empathy from affective empathy here to really understand this.
Walk us through the difference.
Okay, cognitive empathy is the intellectual exercise of deducing what someone else might be thinking, often referred to as theory of mind.
So guessing someone's thoughts based on context.
Right. Affective empathy, on the other hand, is the involuntary physiological mirroring of another person's emotional state.
You feel what they feel.
Exactly. The author may struggle with the cognitive, sociolinguistic calculations required to signal empathy in a neurotypical format, but their affective empathy is completely hyperactive.
It lacks a boundary.
Yes, it lacks an ego boundary entirely. When a neurotypical person hears a stressful story, their neural architecture maintains a firewall. They understand the stress belongs to the narrator.
It's sad, but it's not happening to them.
Right. The author's neural architecture lacks that firewall. The mirror neuron system simulates the narrator's distress so intensely that it becomes a first-person physiological event.
If we visualize that, it is like having a proprietary virtual reality headset permanently wired into your sensory cortex.
That's terrifying, honestly.
It is, but you don't even control the software. Anyone you interact with can just plug their trauma, their stress, and their memories into the console, and you are forced to run the simulation in full sensory high definition.
Which explains so much of the exhaustion.
It is no wonder the author was paralyzed at the thought of entering a physical workspace. If they lack the boundary to block out a stranger's emotional state on a muted Zoom call, sitting in an open-plan office full of anxious corporate employees would be just absolute neurological torture.
The cognitive exhaustion resulting from that constant emotional mirroring is immense. Yet this exact mechanism, this boundaryless simulation of another person's reality, is precisely what the author leveraged to survive a highly complex, potentially degrading real-world interaction.
Ah, the Starbucks interaction.
Let's get into it.
The authors shared this anecdote with the group to illustrate how they attempt to translate their neurological reality to the outside world. They were at a Starbucks with a friend, and due to the auditory processing failure we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive, the author was in serious distress.
The sensory gating was failing.
Complete failure. The ambient noise of the cafe and the frequency of the friend's voice were collapsing into a single overwhelming wall of sound. They were repeatedly asking the friend to clarify what they were saying.
And the friend is described in the text as highly neurotypical, capable, and very entrenched in a sales-oriented, business-minded worldview.
A real go-getter type.
Right. Observing the author's distress, the friend makes what they likely assume is a lighthearted observation, asking if the author's head is panicking.
The power dynamic in this moment is incredibly precarious.
On a nice edge.
The neurodivergent individual is actively experiencing a sensory crisis, and the neurotypical individual minimizes it with a casual, almost patronizing joke.
Are you panicky?
Yeah. And the author's response to this is a staggering display of sociological calculation. They don't retreat. They don't deploy clinical terminology like auditory processing disorder, which the friend would likely just dismiss anyway.
No, they lean right into it.
Instead, the author confirms the panic, but instantly reframes the context. They state, yes, my head is panicking. This is a problem that geniuses have.
Wow. What a pivot.
Right. And they immediately invoke Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Nikola Tesla, and Albert Einstein, explicitly linking their own sensory processing failure to the well-documented neurodivergent traits of these historical and technological titans.
Look at the architecture of that interaction, though. It's brilliant.
It really is.
The author is utilizing their hyperempathy, their ability to simulate the friend's internal state. They intuitively understand that a sales-driven, business-oriented individual values hierarchy, market success, and status.
Those are the metrics that matter to them.
Right. Clinical vulnerability holds absolutely no currency with this friend. So the author constructs a shield out of cultural capital. By associating their neurological deficit with figures the friend implicitly respects and aspires to emulate, the author forces the friend to validate the condition.
It is a masterful manipulation of the friend's own value system.
It's playing the game on their turf.
But the author doesn't stop at the shield. They go on the offensive with a customized analogy. They ask the friend to imagine abandoning all of their high-status interpersonal sales work and instead being forced to engage in solitary manual labor in an isolated room for 8 hours a day for decades.
A nightmare for a salesperson.
Exactly. The author tells the friend, the agony you would feel in that scenario is exactly what going outside and existing in this cafe feels like to me. But in exchange for that agony, my brain is capable of holding ideas bigger than the universe.
It is a brilliant translation of the spiky profile into an economic concept of trade-offs.
Explain the trade-off concept there.
Well, the author is essentially communicating, I am severely deficient in the environmental tolerance that you take for granted, but I possess a capacity for complex, abstract thought that vastly exceeds your own.
Setting a clear boundary of worth.
Right. And we can see exactly how threatening that translation is based on the friend's immediate reaction.
Oh, the friend gets so defensive.
The ego is deeply bruised.
Yeah, the friend counters with, well, I have it hard too, you know?
Which is the moment the author has to instantly pivot from self-advocacy to de-escalation.
It's like diffusing a bomb.
It really is. The author calculates the threat of the bruised ego and immediately validates the friend's reality. They respond, you're right, you must have unimaginable struggles, and if I had to manage the world the way you do, I would probably be depressed. It is amazing how you handle it.
Just smoothing it all over.
They soothe the friend, stroke the ego, and stabilize the entire interaction.
I am going to stop analyzing the brilliance of the tactic for a second, because looking at the mechanics of this exchange actually makes me furious on the author's behalf.
It's profoundly unfair.
Let's tally up the cognitive load here. The author is actively misfiring, unable to filter the background noise at the cafe. While managing that biological crisis, they have to run a complex simulation of their friend's corporate value system.
Rapidly access biographical data on tech billionaires to construct a culturally bulletproof metaphor.
Articulate that metaphor under extreme stress. Monitor the micro-expressions of the friend to detect the exact millisecond their ego is threatened.
And then instantly generate a customized compliment to de-escalate the tension that they didn't even initiate.
Why is the burden of translation entirely on the person whose brain is currently melting down?
You are identifying the core injustice of what's called the double empathy problem.
Okay, tell me more about that.
It was coined by Dr. Damian Milton. This theory posits that the communication breakdown between autistic and non-autistic individuals is not a one-sided deficit in the autistic person.
So it's not just they don't understand us.
Exactly. It is a mutual failure to understand the other's experiential reality.
Mm-hmm.
However, because neurotypical individuals represent the statistical majority and essentially control the social infrastructure, they possess the privilege of remaining monolingual.
They never have to learn the language of neurodivergence.
They never have to learn it. The neurodivergent individual is forced, upon threat of social exile, to become impeccably bilingual. They must manage their own profound discomfort while continuously translating their existence into a format the neurotypical majority finds palatable and non-threatening.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the masking we discussed earlier.
The cost is just staggering.
The author has to be a diplomat for their own disability while actively suffering from it. And while the author successfully navigated that specific interaction with the friend, the diary details a heartbreaking irony that occurred when they returned to the self-help group.
Yeah, this is the twist I didn't see coming.
The author experienced deep fulfillment listening to the varied narratives from across Japan, finding solace in the shared experiences of masking and multitasking failures.
It felt good to be understood on those fronts.
Yeah, but they articulate a profound sense of disappointment regarding their most severe, debilitating symptom. In a virtual room entirely populated by individuals diagnosed with developmental disorders, not a single person shared or understood the author's specific sensory experience.
They were still alone in that one aspect.
The symptom they describe is extreme. The author states that simply walking outside and existing in public space causes a catastrophic physical and neurological reaction.
It's not just anxiety, it's physical.
Right. Their body physically stiffens.
Hmm.
The motor control breaks down, causing their hands and feet to move simultaneously and awkwardly. But the internal experience is even more severe. They describe that when they walk past a stranger on the street, the data and thoughts of that stranger flood directly into their brain, inducing absolute paralysis.
Okay, to understand the physical stiffening, we really have to look at proprioception and the integration of the visual and motor systems.
What's proprioception for those listening?
Proprioception is basically the nervous system's ability to sense the position and movement of the body in space, knowing where your arm is without looking at it.
Got it.
For a neurotypical brain, visual data from the environment, the street, the passing cars, the pedestrians, is smoothly integrated with motor commands via the dorsal stream in the brain.
It's automatic.
Right. For the author, the sheer volume of visual and sensory data in an uncontrolled public environment completely overwhelms the integration process.
So it short circuits.
The brain cannot process the external data and maintain the internal motor map simultaneously. The system essentially defaults to a locked state, which causes the physical stiffening and the loss of rhythmic gait.
And the mental flooding, the sensation of absorbing a stranger's thoughts just by passing them.
That is the ultimate extreme of the hyper-empathy and boundary dissolution we analyzed earlier. The author's nervous system is constantly scanning the micro-expressions, the posture, and the energetic state of every single passing individual, and attempting to process all of that data as highly relevant primary information.
It is an unsustainable data load.
Completely.
Yeah.
And when they asked the group for mitigation strategies, the silence from the other members was absolute.
No one had an answer.
No one.
Which perfectly illustrates the reality of the spiky profile. We need a better visual for this than the standard audio equalizer board people usually use.
Oh, I'm curious. What's your visual?
It's more like rolling a character in a really complex role-playing game.
Okay, I'm with you.
And you take every single available stat point and you dump them entirely into perception and abstract intelligence, leaving absolutely 0 points for agility or environmental resistance.
Min-maxing the brain.
Exactly. The character can solve the most complex puzzles in the game instantly, but if they step on a basic gravel path, their movement speed drops to 0 and they take critical damage from the wind.
That is a fantastic way to explain it, and the isolation of that stat distribution is immense. We tend to view marginalized communities as monoliths. The assumption is that if you find a group of neurodivergent people, you have found your exact tribe.
You expect everyone to just get it?
But developmental disorders are so highly individualized, so distinctly spiky, that you can be surrounded by your peers and still find that your most agonizing daily hurdle is completely alien, even to them. The author is entirely alone in finding a solution for their environmental paralysis.
Yet, despite that specific isolation, the overarching tone of the diary entry is not defeatist at all.
No, it's actually quite analytical.
Very much so. In fact, the author engages in this fascinating meta-analysis of their own behavior. They recognize that the very act of seeking out this self-help group, despite the lack of a perfect symptom match, is a crucial psychological indicator of an impending life shift.
They're reading their own tea leaves, essentially.
Yeah, they map a historical pattern in their own behavior. They note that years prior, they had sought out online communities for adult children and attended Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. They deduce that their nervous system subconsciously seeks out these structured support networks as a precursor to taking drastic, necessary action.
It is the gathering of psychological scaffolding before attempting a major structural demolition.
Beautifully put. And the objective of the current demolition is to achieve complete autonomy and independence.
Which brings us to the catalyst.
Right. This drive for independence is where the narrative takes a sharp turn into family systems theory. The author reveals that this entire push was triggered by a ferocious, unprecedented conflict with their mother.
A massive blowout.
The author categorizes this fight not as a tragedy, but as their very first rebellious phase argument.
Which is a highly clinical, objective categorization of a deeply emotional event.
Right. Most people would just say, I had a horrible fight with my mom.
In developmental psychology, the rebellious phase, which typically occurs in adolescence, is a required milestone. It is the process of individuation, where the child tests boundaries and rejects parental authority to forge their own distinct identity.
It's how we become our own people.
Exactly. However, when an individual is neurodivergent, undiagnosed, and expending massive amounts of cognitive energy simply masking just to survive their environment, that developmental milestone is delayed.
The system just doesn't have that excess caloric or emotional energy to wage a war for independence.
The survival protocol completely overrides the individuation protocol.
So it just gets put on pause.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when the rebellion finally erupts later in life, it is often explosive, but it is fundamentally an indicator of psychological health. The author views the conflict as a scream for autonomy, a sign that they finally possess the internal resources to demand differentiation from the family unit.
But the family system does not view it as an indicator of health.
Oh, not at all.
The reaction from the siblings to this assertion of boundaries is entirely punitive. The author documents that following the argument, the siblings initiated what they term siege tactics.
Siege tactics. That's a terrifying term to use for your own family.
It really is. They systematically cut off the author's access to daily necessities and food, utilizing deprivation to force the author either out of the home or back into compliance.
And in family systems therapy, families operate on the principle of homeostasis.
Meaning they want to keep things the same no matter what.
Right. Toxic or dysfunctional families rely on each member playing a specific, often pathological role to maintain the system's balance. Often, a neurodivergent member is cast as the identified patient, the dependent, the problem, the locus of the family's anxiety.
So they serve a purpose for the family's dysfunction.
Yes, so when the author initiates the delayed rebellion and attempts to break out of that assigned role, it threatens the entire homeostasis of the family system.
The whole house of cards shakes.
The siblings' deployment of siege tactics, like restricting food, is an extreme, abusive mechanism designed to crush the individuation and force the author back into their designated role as the dependent.
It is literal physiological blackmail, but how the author processes this abuse is perhaps the most staggering revelation in the entire text.
It shows incredible resilience.
They do not internalize the rejection. They do not succumb to the emotional terror of having their basic survival needs weaponized by their own blood. Instead, the author states that they view the siblings' actions clinically, explicitly thanking the siblings for providing good material for human analysis.
I mean, consider the psychological self-preservation required to execute that reframe.
It's superhuman.
The author is subjected to domestic abuse, and their response is to instantly retreat into the safety of the intellect. They utilize intellectualization as a primary defense mechanism.
Distancing themselves from the pain.
By transforming their abusive siblings from family members who are betraying me into fascinating case studies of pathological human behavior, the author completely neutralizes the emotional payload of the abuse.
Notice how the author does the exact same thing with their siblings as they did with the friend at Starbucks.
Yes, it's the exact same mechanism, just scaled up to handle trauma.
When the environment becomes hostile, the author detaches, elevates above the situation, and analyzes the mechanical flaws in the neurotypical people attacking them.
They turn a threat into a data point.
It is an incredibly powerful, if tragic, survival strategy. It protects the core self from being shattered by the family's toxicity, preserving the necessary energy to execute their ultimate goal of escaping the house.
And that synthesis of hyperempathy, intellectual detachment, and the exhaustion of masking creates such a comprehensive portrait of the neurodivergent experience. The cognitive load required to merely exist in these systems is astronomical.
Which forces us to look back at the overarching architecture we have dismantled today. We started by examining the quiet terror of entering a virtual room,
Exposing the brutal metabolic cost of masking, of running that flawless simulation of normalcy until the hardware melts down.
We explored the structural hostility of a generalist workplace demanding parallel processing from a highly specialized sequential brain.
We redefined empathy entirely, looking at the agonizing reality of possessing an ego boundary so permeable that a stranger's stress becomes a first-person physiological crisis.
And we witnessed the relentless sociolinguistic gymnastics required to translate that crisis into a language that a fragile, neurotypical society can tolerate.
The essential through-line here is the invisible burden of adaptation.
It always falls on them.
Always. Whether it is redesigning the workflow of an administrative desk, translating sensory overload into a metaphor about tech billionaires, or intellectualizing the abuse of a family system to survive a siege, the individual in this diary is constantly, relentlessly adapting to an environment that refuses to adapt to them.
If you are listening to this and you find yourself exhausted at the end of the day, not from the work you did, but from the persona you had to sustain to be permitted to do that work, You are experiencing just a fraction of the friction detailed in this account.
A tiny fraction.
Understanding the extreme mechanisms of the spiky profile forces us to abandon the assumption that a composed exterior implies a comfortable interior. The logic and the eloquence you observe in someone might just be the exhaust fumes of a processor running at maximum capacity to prevent a systemic crash.
It absolutely demands a fundamental shift in how we interpret competence and comfort in all of our interactions.
So, as we close this analysis, I want you to reconsider the space you occupy. The next time you are sitting in that coffee shop and your brain effortlessly filters out the roar of the espresso machine, recognize that your comfort is a neurological privilege, not a universal baseline.
Keep that in mind.
And I want you to ask yourself a harder question about your own adaptations. The author of this diary was forced to construct an elaborate mask of competence just to survive, only to discover that the mask was so effective it blinded everyone to their actual suffering.
It worked too well.
Exactly. Look at the environments you navigate daily. What specific mask are you maintaining right now just to ensure the comfort of the people around you? And more importantly, what essential, authentic parts of your own specific nature are you suffocating in order to keep that mask from slipping?
A vital, vital question for anyone navigating a structured society.
Thank you for joining us in the deep end today. We will see you on the next one.